adversary. But what I wanted to do, and I gave you all about a day's notice on this, is to come in and have more of a conversation on a topic that has interested me for a long time. I participated in a dinner. I can't mention who was at the dinner, but we'll just say is a very, very senior, high-level, mostly civilian, but some active duty defense personnel and some intelligence personnel, where we were talking about, and people were just taking pot shots. I think it had to do with the drinks we were having. People's tongues were getting looser. And we were talking about things that were really impediments to success in dealing with things. And it's not because we're in an era where framing is everything, but we are in an era where how you talk about things, how you're perceived around the world matters. I was in the UK recently. I met with the foreign minister of, what's his name, David Miliband, who's the foreign minister of the UK, who's a blogger, and he wanted to meet bloggers. This is in contrast to the Germans who had me expelled from a meeting because I wasn't a serious journalist when I was meeting Mark Steinmeier. But it was an interesting session, and the British also are spending a lot of time in the language of talking about what we're doing around the world. How do you deal with terrorism? What sorts of things are you doing? And in September 2005, we helped organize a major conference called Terrorism, Security, and America's Purpose that was followed up by a second conference called Beyond Bullets, and looking at the economic dimensions of the question, focusing on terrorism. Richard Vague, whom I've asked to sort of share some of his views today, was our partner in that. And I would say that our objective was to bring in 1,500 or so of the more involved participants in policymaking in Washington at that time and try to do away with this metaphor of the global war on terror, because while it may sell at home, it really does complicate things abroad. And I think we succeeded for about 3.5 months. And then Don Rumsfeld and, people got together at Crawford and said, why aren't we saying global war on terror? And basically brought it back over the DOD's, most of the Department of Defense's objection. But I have been intrigued by the endurability, the enduring nature of this term and metaphor, and I thought it would be interesting to have a discussion with some people I respect who think about different dimensions of this, and then other people in the room. And I really do want this to be a conversation. But what we're going to do is start off with 10, 12, 15 minutes from Richard Vague sharing some of his thoughts. I think Richard Vague is a very, very important benchmark for how, and I don't mean this offensively to any of you, but how normal people who are not Washington Beltway types think about these questions. And Richard is a conservative, Republican CEO. He was the credit card king of this country. He's now involved in the energy business. But essentially what intrigued me when I met him, and we knew each other for a long time before we actually did any big deals, he was hanging out and very, from his experiences with the economy after the Vietnam War and whatnot, just saw nobody from the business community raising key questions about why this was so bad for the country on many other levels besides, moral reasons, humanitarian reasons, but there were bottom line reasons that drove a lot of his interest. And he would try and explain his situation to golf buddies and people that he would run around in the Rotary Club circuit and whatever. And he wrote a thing called Terrorism, A Brief for Americans, and I really liked it. And I'm just going to share some ideas here. And I've invited Flint Leverett, who directs our Geopolitics of Energy initiative. Here, Flint was President Bush's chief advisor on the National Security Council staff on Middle East issues. He was sort of the pre-Elliott Abrams. And I have to tell you, I think that Flint Leverett and the guy sitting next to him, Daniel Levy, if we just let the two of them, gave them some kind of in the old days, like with Rome, they've got the imperial seal to go just do whatever needed to be done. The world would be a lot better if we were just organized that way. But Flint Leverett, in his story, along with his brilliant wife, Hillary Mann, who is one of the leading Iran specialists the government had, are profiled. I don't often promote Esquire magazine. What's her name? The Charlize Theron. I'm not good at pop culture, but the hot actress is on the cover of it. But page 104 is an incredible 5-page profile of Flint Leverett and Hillary Mann, and the story of how close we were to possibly getting U.S.-Iran relations on a different track. Why is that important? Because Our Congress just said the IRGC is a terrorist organization, global war on terror. It does raise some concerns. So, which my friend up here keeps reminding. I wrote an article called Why Bush Won't Go to War with Iran for Salon.com, and I heard a lot from this gentleman here, which we'll get to later, on why I'm wrong. But then Daniel Levy.
The short response is, inshallah.
Yeah. Daniel Levy has committed his life to achieving a. I'm not a corny. I don't consider I'm not a warm and fuzzy type person. I don't like. He's got an initiative called Prospects for Peace, but that's at the Century Foundation. At New America Foundation, Daniel Levy is director of the Middle East Policy Initiative, something that sounds, I think, a little bit less warm and fuzzy. But Daniel is going to achieve peace between Israel and Palestine someday, something that's viable, and deal with this. He has been active as a negotiator in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations for a long time. And he's done more literally, and I'm not embellishing this, than anyone else I know to do this in real ways. And he's like I am, a tilting point guy. He's not somebody who spends a lot of time just talking to those people who already agree with him. He spends a lot of time recruiting people who don't. Why is that important? Well, Hamas, Hezbollah, other components of the so-called global war on terror, another initiative here. And then we have Christopher Preble. Chris, and I added him late in the day because Chris is great. He calls himself Steve Clemens' friendly adversary, and he directs the defense policy program at Cato Institute. He and I were co-founders, and I think I'm still on the board, of the Coalition for Realistic Foreign Policy. And Chris has been out there, talking to Americans over, in many different ways about the choices we're making on our fronts. I think coming in, and this is, some people are going to be coming on, it's going to be more like a roundtable discussion, kind of like a town hall. Jay Solomon will be joining us, who's just ascended to become the new head of really foreign affairs correspondence for the Wall Street Journal. Neil King is going to be doing more oil. That's Flint's area. And so Jay Solomon will be coming in, and he's been interviewing people in Hezbollah and others. And so I brought some voices in, but the fact is Bob Dreyfus is in here, Ezra Klein, there are many others, Mitzi Wertheim, who all are in and out of various establishments of importance here in Washington. And I wanted to have more of a conversation because I think it is important to do it. I'm trying to think about whether or not we initiate something much larger scale to try to deal with. If you were to put together a smart strategy that would deal with the terrorism question, I'll put my cards on the table. I look at terrorism as a stage performance. Terrorism is trying to appeal to an audience and to try to achieve legitimacy in the eyes of a public. We spend a lot of time in our national strategy trying to kill the actors, but we don't really care much for the audience, in my quick critique. And I'm trying to sort of think about how do you mechanize that in more usable forms in public policy, and to talk to legislators to turn it into something that sounds good, into a practical pattern. So that's what the purpose is of today, and we're gonna video this and think about it. So it's a think session, a big brainstorming session. So I want to ask Richard Vague to launch us in discussion, and then I'm going to moderate some commentary, reactions, and other questions for our team here, and then involve it more formally. So Richard, and excuse the sound stuff here. All right.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for your time this morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. And Steve, I appreciate your leadership. Steve is, as you all know, brilliant and dynamic leader in thinking about foreign policy. We can accomplish far more in the so-called war on terror by building up than by tearing down. We're way off course, and our current policies are increasing global terrorism instead, bringing more recruits and violence to the cause of terrorism. We should build up in places like Morocco, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Turkey, countries that are already on the tenuous path to political and economic democracy, because positive accomplishments in one Muslim nation will have good effect in all other Muslim nations. This will be especially true if accompanied by a resolution of the terrible dispute between Israel and Palestine, whatever that resolution is, because that dispute is at the heart of global terrorism. I have historically voted as a conservative, as Steve mentioned, but there is nothing intrinsically conservative or Republican about the war in Iraq, or any war. Republicans were elected to end the Korean War. Republicans were elected to end the Vietnam War. Since the invasion of Iraq, the price of oil has gone from $28 a barrel to over $80 a barrel. I think it touched $90 a barrel yesterday. And short-term interest rates have gone up by 400 basis points. Our deficit has gone from essentially non-existent to record highs, all influenced, if even partially, by this war and its trillion-dollar cost. The sustained drain of war, by the way, has also left us more vulnerable to the inevitable other financial stresses, such as the current mortgage calamity. Now, some may think that terrorism is a primarily Islamic phenomenon, but terrorism and terrorists have existed essentially in all historical eras, all countries, and all religions. In fact, in the period since World War II, there have been more occurrences of terrorism in stable democracies than in any other type of country, including the acts of white supremacists in the United States, the Red Brigade in Germany, the Red Army faction in Japan, and others. But the influence of these terrorists is usually very marginal. So the key question then becomes, why aren't terrorists in these Muslim countries equally marginal? What is it in these Middle Eastern countries that causes the broader population to respond supportively to terrorism? Wherever you look in history, now or in the past, the answer is the same. Terrorists gain support where there is occupation or oppression. By occupation, by the way, we mean like that of Ireland by England that led to the IRA. By oppression, we mean like the dictatorship in Peru that led to the Shining Path. Throughout time and across the globe, people are not predisposed to follow the lead of terrorists. They instead want what people everywhere have always wanted: meaning and purpose in their lives, sustenance and economic opportunity, family, friends, happiness. They want to matter. They want to have respect. For a population to succumb to the overtures of terrorists, circumstances must be extreme, which is the terrible case under both occupation and oppression. The common ground between oppression and occupation is that people are deprived of participation in government, and the basic obligations of a government to its people are not met, especially in the enforcement of property rights, safety, and access to opportunity. When this happens, the results are poverty and despair, the very things that make a population vulnerable to the overtures of terrorists and the alternatives they present. Terrorists are known for their acts, which of course are horrifying and murderous. But these acts are almost always the only military means the weak and out of power can afford to fight their oppressors, and thus they recur throughout history. Terrorist groups can be characterized by something else, too. They gain relevance by fulfilling those basic obligations of government, such as hospitals and schools, that are unmet. People respond to those that provide for what they need. It follows, then, that terrorism exists among Muslims because so many Muslim countries have long been subject to occupation and oppression. Of the 6.7 billion people in the world today, roughly 1.3 billion are Muslim. 45 of the world's 193 countries are predominantly Muslim. Of these 45, 41 are former colonies or subsumed Soviet states, harshly excluded from economic opportunity, gutted of leadership, and subjected to servitude, imprisonment, and worse. Becoming colonies hobble the development of political and economic leadership within these countries, so much so that we shouldn't be surprised at the current state of leadership and institutions in these countries. and their resulting propensity towards dictatorships. In fact, of these 45 countries, 37, by our imperfect count, are still not democracies, and Western nations still back some number of these dictators. Given the 1.3 billion person size of this population, if even the tiniest fraction are terrorists, the effect is large. In contrast, it was almost impossible for the impact of IRA terrorists to be felt much beyond the shores of Northern Ireland, since the population of Northern Ireland was less than 1 million. Allow me to make a crucial additional observation. Because Islamic fundamentalism is so intertwined in the minds, in the press, in actuality with Muslim terrorism, it is critical to comment for a moment on fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, whether in Islam or Judaism or Christianity, is a reaction to great stress or rapid change within a society or country. Where you have great stress or change, where you have rapid economic, social, or moral dislocation, where the moorings of life have come loose, fundamentalism has flourished. Where you have war, pogroms, or oppression, where there is fear about the future, fundamentalism has flourished. Fundamentalism is grasping for certainty in a world of great uncertainty and change. So this religious fundamentalism, rather than being a cause of terrorism, is something grasped by the oppressed to cope with their oppression. The presence of fundamentalism in large numbers in certain countries, rather than simply being a sign of a backslide, is instead evidence of how much stress they are enduring or how fast they are being pulled forward. So, the best way to reduce terrorism is by addressing situations of oppression and occupation. We clearly need to track terrorists in order to prevent future attacks and to find those that have attacked us in the past so they can do no more harm. We need to do this. Still, to get to the underlying causes of terrorism and to prevent the ranks of future terrorists from increasing, we must focus on occupation and oppression. Importantly, a terrorist group's efforts to overcome its oppressor rarely leads to an enduring solution. In fact, most often when terrorists overcome an oppressor or occupier, the result is more of the same. Witness the Bolsheviks' overthrow of the Tsar. Occupation and oppression can only be overcome by democracy, by ceding power to the governed, to the broad population, and by separating and limiting the powers of government. This was the strong contention of the Bush administration, and they were correct. But crucially, democracy cannot take root. The distribution or decentralization of power cannot move forward unless it is accompanied by an equally vigorous distribution of wealth and economic opportunity among that same broad population. Power cannot be held by the broad population unless that broad population can afford to hold that power. The Bush administration failed to grasp the essential role of broadened economic opportunity in building democracy, and its lack of spending in this area reflects this. And in Iraq, the Bush administration failed by making its most visible attempt at building a democracy in a place where a civil war was about to break out. Some have observed, by the way, that elections in Palestine and elsewhere, democracy, have led to greater extremism and thus should be deferred or avoided. Our answer is, of course they have. Because the economic conditions there, not to mention the realities of governments, are as dire as anywhere in the world. People vote against governments under which they are suffering. That's why the economic dimension is mandatory. Here's an example where the introduction of economic and political democracy quelled the terrorists. In Peru in the 1980s and 90s, the Shining Path was a murderous terrorist group violently opposed to Peru's corrupt and autocratic government. The majority of Peruvians were in fact very poor and were thus open to the communist message of their oppressors. Today, the Shining Path essentially no longer exists. One of the largest reasons was the property rights reform championed by, among others, Hernando de Soto, comparable to what was done through homestead acts in America during the 1800s and the land distribution in Japan after World War II, which were keys to creating the large middle class that is now found in both countries. Peru's land reform occurred in conjunction with Peru's movement to democracy, and land reform both benefited from democracy and helped ensure that democracy's success. Together they made the Shining Path infinitely less relevant. Thus, the most central question in terrorism isn't how to stop terrorists, it is instead how to prevent future terrorists, which is how to broadly distribute both power and economic opportunity in countries where oppression and occupation now prevail. This formula will also work in Iraq, but only after the enormous challenge of dealing with Iraq's civil war. And we believe that the soft partition plan, such as was used in Bosnia-Herzegovina, is the best method for achieving the stability that is a prerequisite for economic recovery. And it's important to note, while we're talking about ethnic and religious civil war, that countries fracturing into religious and ethnic factions because of duress is one of the dominant facts of the last century. And we know that reversing any such fracture is an extremely difficult thing and cannot reasonably proceed without a foundation of economic plenty and representative government. We can accomplish far more in the so-called war on terror by building up rather than tearing down. We would invoke, as so many have in other circumstances, the Marshall Plan. Our policies towards reducing terrorism and effecting economic and political democratization in Muslim countries should reflect the spirit and character of George Marshall. This initiative should incorporate our relationship with all 45 predominantly Muslim countries, not just one or a few, from Morocco to Syria to Dubai to Azerbaijan to Somalia and Indonesia and more. Our relationship with each of these countries added together shapes the global Muslim community's view and posture towards the U.S. Successful relationships with Turkey and Morocco, for example, positively affect the perception of America in Syria. Negative relations with Palestinians adversely affects our relationships with Muslims in all other countries and, equally importantly, in the Muslim diaspora. We have veered dangerously off course, but what is powerful here is that our instinct to reach out and help and our instinct to subdue terrorism, which are often thought of as two separate issues, can be met together as one. And it's in our own self-interest to act. If we take the $1 trillion or $2 trillion that's being spent on the Iraq War, or any small fraction thereof, and spend it on building up rather than tearing down, then, and only then, will global terrorism decrease. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. I thought this is important because Richard is not a policy wonk in Washington, but he's someone who's thinking deeply about these questions of how to connect. And I'm always, when you're a blogger, you're trying to reach to people, and one of the great things I'm accused of is being too much insider and whatnot and not hearing what other people are thinking or how they're taking it. I'm heartened by the fact that and I keep calling him a conservative CEO. I know who his Republican friends are. I know he's a Biden fan, but that's because he likes Joe Biden, your boss. But he also had a business in Wilmington. So, but it's useful to hear how other people are sort of staking these questions out. I've also turned on the air because I thought if we jacked up the air and then turned it off beforehand, but I was beginning to melt. So my apologies to all of you. Let me, and I've also learned that we've given you the terrorism brief outside as well as the Esquire article. And the Esquire article is great. It really is. Read it because it shows you how close we came to a very different future. But let me start our discussion, which is a roundtable, and move around the front here, but then involve all of you. But I want to pose a question to Flint Leverett. Flint is an expert not just on oil, but he's an expert virtually on all the governments in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Syria. He's got a book out, China, Russia. How consequential do you think the global war on terror frame, the war with us or against us framing of this has been? And of course, you were part of the administration that launched that frame.
I should say that I think that perhaps the biggest mistake in framing the war on terror was made early on. It was the speech that President Bush made to the Congress, to the nation, less than 2 weeks after the September 11 attacks. I think the date was September 20th. And it is in that speech that he defined the global war on terror as a war on all terrorism. And it's in that speech that he defined also the standard that if you sponsor terrorists, then you are the same as a terrorist. I was at the State Department at the time on the policy planning staff, and I was not alone as that speech was being prepared. And when we saw the draft that would ultimately be delivered, I was not alone in, I think it's not too strong to say my anguish over that formulation. We needed to declare a war on Al-Qaeda. We needed to declare a war on Al-Qaeda and its supporters, first and foremost the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. But to define the war on terror in the way that this administration did, to some degree we had lost the battle even before it had really been joined. Because we defined a war that it's not a question that we couldn't win it, but by defining it in this way, we hamstrung our foreign policy and we set ourselves on a trajectory where our influence in, I would argue, the world's most strategically vital region is in serious decline. Now, how has that formulation hamstrung us? Well, it's hamstrung us in a number of ways. First of all, it meant that we weren't really focused on Al-Qaeda and destroying that threat. We let ourselves get distracted primarily by Iraq. But even when we were still on the ground in Afghanistan, we weren't really focused on finishing the job, either in terms of killing Al-Qaeda or in terms of post-conflict stabilization in Afghanistan. I will never forget the Deputies Committee meeting at the White House at which Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith proclaimed with regard to Afghanistan that counter-narcotics is not part of the war on terror. That's a verbatim quote. Any journalist here may have that on the record. Larry Wilkerson has said that that Douglas Feith is he cannot think of a dumber man that he has ever met.
Larry, by the way, is former Chief of Staff of the State Department.
Yes, and I certainly can't. I find it hard to think in the context of foreign policy meetings in which I participated, and remember I served in the Bush administration, it's hard for me to think of a dumber statement than that. But that's what he said. We really were not focused on the real terrorist threat that was confronting the United States. We defined the war in such a way that we could get into all kinds of mischief, and mischief is precisely what we got into. I think
Can I interrupt you just there for a moment? Even if the president had framed the war more broadly, created this big overarching umbrella, couldn't you, I mean, what comes to mind is Bob Kaplan, who used to be a senior fellow here, had some tutorials with President Bush both before and after 9/11, and, just to be crude and blunt, and Kaplan may deny this, but he basically told the president to talk democracy but deal with thugs. And that you had to deal with thugs and their realities, but you also had to talk democracy. And so there was a difference between what you might say and the practical realities of what you had to do. So the question is, did the administration get so taken with the metaphor that they were creating and get lost in that and lose the practical realities of what they had to do? Because there are lots of times where there's tension between what is said and what is done. And why isn't what was done better?
I frankly don't think you had to talk about democracy. I think you needed to talk about killing the people who had engineered the 9/11 attacks. I don't think a president uniquely empowered after 9/11 would have had any difficulty selling that to the American people. There is nothing inevitable about the choices that this administration made. They were choices, and this administration made them. You could have chosen a very, very different course. You did not have to make this, a campaign to end evil. You could have made it a campaign to put down the people who had killed 3,000 people on American soil. I think the American people would have rallied just fine behind that sort of effort. But by defining in the way we did, we also imposed other limits on ourselves. We had, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, we had various state sponsors of terrorism, Iran and Syria most notably, coming to us and offering us various kinds of assistance. Now, I have no illusions about why these states were doing this. Here the United States was getting ready to go off on a self-declared global war on terror. They'd been listed by the State Department as state sponsors of terrorism. They didn't want to get caught on the downside of this. So they say, we don't like Al-Qaeda any more than you do. Let us help you against them. This is a real opportunity, not just to get tactical assistance against the Al-Qaeda threat, but it was, or in the case of Iran, to get tactical support in Afghanistan. It was an opportunity to flip these states, to engage them, to take their assistance, but say, okay, but we need to have a broader conversation with you about your own links to terrorist groups, about your own place in the region, and if we can resolve these issues, we're prepared to give you a very, very different kind of strategic relationship with the United States. We had a real opportunity to do that, but because we defined the war on terror in theological terms, I had to sit through hours and hours of meetings in the Situation Room where people talked about preserving the purity of the war on terror. I mean, how stupid is that?
Preserving the purity of the war on terror?
Yes. You may also have that as a quote, if anybody wants.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Be careful with Ezra.
And it also meant that for states that were our traditional strategic partners in the region, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, we couldn't really do what we needed to do with those relationships because we were getting too wrapped around the axle with whether some Saudi prince somewhere was sending money to madrasas in Pakistan. And, I think it really hamstrung us, it limited our options unnecessarily, and put us on a dysfunctional strategic path in this very important region, and we're reaping the fruits of that today.
Thank you, Flint. Could you hand the mic to Daniel, because I want him to talk a little bit about Daniel's been so, and I mean this in the friendliest way, so in the weeds, but also strategically, but in the weeds on the Israeli-Palestinian issue that so focused on it, but it's become such a bleeding ulcer for so long that the strategic dimensions of it are so profound, which is why I think he now lives in the United States rather than Tel Aviv. But I'm interested in how the framing of the global war on terror affected the Palestinian-Israeli debate, affected you, affected the on-the-ground realities in Israel and in that region.
Well, maybe to reflect on another kind of moment that was going on in Israel while Flint was sitting in those meetings where people were talking about the purity.
Can you stand up and do that again? That was kind of cool.
No, exactly. I just realised I had it. When Flint was sitting in those meetings, because as you can imagine, those who had been arguing for a long time in Israel that the framework,
Come sit there because we want to put you in the camera.
but the framework through which you have to understand this is the occupation rather than one of terror.
Your word.
And who had made advances in the 90s as Israel more and more saw the self-destructive nature of the ongoing occupation. So for those who had advanced that argument, this was a big oh no moment. It was an oy vey moment. Now, obviously, there was a whole other group of people in Israel who were dancing the hora in the streets when this framing of the war on terror was going on. And this was a way to roll back Oslo, to roll back the engagement with the PLO, to roll back everything that was about what had been built really since Rabin took the plunge. Since at the end of the Reagan administration, when the dialogue was begun between the Americans and the PLO, since the PLO made the declaration in Algiers, and since Fatah and the mainstream PLO took the strategic decision that we can win Palestinian independence, dignity and deoccupation by going along a route of working with America and Israel. And there were setbacks for sure, but we went along that path. And those who were believers in Greater Israel, were believers in the settlement project, were dead set in terms of trying to bring down that edifice. Literally, it was the most fantastic moment, because then they could come to you, not that it was so difficult, because there were enough, unfortunately I have to say it, enough Likudniks in your own government here in Washington who were waiting for an opportunity to kind of strut their Likudnik stuff. And here it was. And so now you understood our predicament. Now you know why we can't cede an inch to the terrorists coming to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And the whole paradigm of occupation was lost. I would argue, although I still see far too few signs of it, until people here begin to realize what occupation is as well. As you're stuck in your own Iraqi quagmire. Hopefully,
so let me just say, you're saying occupation, and without, I mean, you work with a lot of Republicans, but I can kind of call you part of the progressive left, so to speak, right?
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah, and you guys,
don't exactly hide that
you're
one.
both dissident Republicans, and you're both using the word of occupation. I just want to note the language of occupation for a minute. We can, come in, but punctuation point. Please proceed.
No, it's actually, for me, it's very sad that we even have to have this conversation.
Can I drag a bit of your personal life into here for a minute?
Depends which bit, actually.
Not the nights out in Adams Morgan, but I attended Daniel's wedding, and Tony Blair was there, and I had an opportunity to talk to Tony Blair, and he's now the Middle East Quartet envoy He made some shocking statements that I can't believe that if he knows you very well he would have made. He was shocked by the human conditions, the miserable human conditions of what he's experienced and seen in Gaza and Palestine, that he says this is an incredible travesty, a tragedy unfolding, and that he had no idea. How can someone of Tony Blair's stature and involvement making these decisions, and just linking back to Richard Vague's comments for a moment about respect and you know what happens in arenas of tremendous poverty, how can this gentleman who attended your wedding have had that understanding and expressed it so freely, and doesn't it bother you?
Well, go to any of your representatives here who aren't exactly strangers to visiting Israel. I haven't been able to do it yet, but if any of you can or have, I think it was well over 10% of the House during this summer recess were in Israel. I think there may well have been more who were in Israel than were in Iraq visiting, and they very freely appropriate certain appropriations, and they make it very, very difficult for aid to go to anything Palestinian. And if you were to confront them with these realities, I honestly think it would be a huge eye-opener. The delegations of freshmen, and not only freshmen, Republicans and Democrats who visited, spent 7-8 days meeting with just about every Israeli and defense person. They spent 1.5 hours in a very, very sterilized Ramallah environment of the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, and they'd seen both sides, so it's fine. But really, it does sadden me that one even has to have this conversation about the role of an occupation, and it most saddens me, of course, from if I go back to my point of departure, and my point of departure being what that overlay of the paradigm through which America chose to respond to 9/11, what that paradigm did to the reality in the region, which of course then reflected back and cast a huge shadow on your ability then to rewind and to work yourselves back from where it had gone. Now, Flint spoke that it wasn't inevitable that this would be framed as a war on terror, and there was no inevitability to a president not coming down with a "we're going to fight back Al-Qaeda." What I also wonder, though, is how inevitable and how unfortunate it was just how little pushback there was against that framing, because that was the other thing you saw, and I would put it down to three things. One of them, which I don't know enough about, but I'm pretty much convinced of, is that the party of opposition. Exactly. So I don't need to finish that point. But especially when it came to a lack of self-confidence on national security issues, and I think that was a very important framing piece. A second thing is it's very, and here I'll be a bit more generous and understanding. To make the counter-argument when you're being told we concede no ground to terrorists, and this terrorist looks like that terrorist, look, they use the same means, looks like this other terrorist, to say we cede no ground to those people, constructing the alternative narrative of root causes, legitimate grievances, draining the swamp, why is it so easy for them to recruit, the rallying cry of undealt with grievances that the US feeds into. I don't think it was impossible to make that argument. I appreciate that it's a difficult argument to make, but the ground was ceded so dramatically. And unfortunately, I don't think we've turned that corner at all yet. I still think that to make those arguments, you're more likely to be attacked as an apologist, an appeaser, as being soft on terror, than as the smart person who's going to help us turn the corner and actually get to grips with this and be more effective against Al-Qaeda and restabilize the region and the world in which America conducts its national security interests. Unfortunately, we haven't turned that corner. It's much more difficult to do 6 years later. The fact that there was no pushback on day one made it more difficult, and I think there's a third reason. And I'm not convinced that this is the dominant reason, but I think it was a factor. If you go down the road of we have to take grievances seriously, we have to look at root causes, there are other ways of dealing with this, you very soon and inevitably, unavoidably, come face to face with the Israeli occupation. You can't build a counter-narrative and say, well, if we weren't so supportive of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, perhaps if we didn't have so many American bases there, people wouldn't be quite so peeved at us. You can't begin to touch those issues without saying, and hey, we have a special relationship with Israel, and that special relationship plays out in a way that is an enabler of occupation and an enabler of the daily bloody soap opera watched in every Arab and many Muslim homes around the world, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, rather than an enabler of a resolution of that issue. And I think that's had devastating consequences. And especially perhaps when I look at the Dem side and you see the lack of pushback, I think that it may even subconsciously have stopped in a place where you didn't directly confront that issue. But the knowledge that you couldn't go down that route without addressing the Israeli-Palestinian question, I think, was there. It had devastating consequences on the peace camp in Israel. And perhaps just as a last comment in kicking this part of it off, it's very linked. If I come full circle back to my opening comment, it's very linked to what one's seen on the Palestinian side vis-a-vis Hamas and Fatah. Because if you remember what I argued, that in '88, Fatah took the strategic decision and went down a path that basically said, we are tying our colors to the ability of America to deliver Israel for a peace process that brings with it deoccupation, and we move consistently away from violence as that delivers the goods. Once that equation, and maybe it was already proved false in the 90s, I'm not saying it was going swimmingly until 9/11, but it was going somewhere. There was a credibility to a Fatah PLO claim that this could deliver. As soon as that claim was bereft of any credibility whatsoever in Palestinian eyes, then either Fatah had to shift direction or Fatah would be left behind. And in fact, both happened. The Fatah Tanzim local fighter leadership, people like Marwan Barghouti, who now serves several life sentences in an Israeli jail until we finally come to our senses and release him, which will happen. People like Marwan Barghouti, I can tell you, we had meetings. Of course, the Intifada broke out before 9/11, so as I'm saying, this had already gone some way, but we had meetings and he said, look, either the peace process begins to deliver something, or the only way we can push back against Hamas is to start delivering violence. And gradually that has been eroded and eroded and eroded. I have my own position, of course, on a group like Hamas, which I think is grievance-based. I think when you lump all the Islamists together, I don't understand why one would seek to increase exponentially one's pool of enemies. I know, it's a bit of a strange thought. But there are groups out there ideologically committed to a caliphate, to being anti-Western, to using violent tactics to achieve that, to revolution, to bringing down the current nation-state system, who I genuinely don't believe one can progress with in a dialogue or in any kind of an understanding. I just think there are groups out there like that. I think there is a huge spectrum of political Islamists out there who are not of that ilk. Hamas does not attack Western targets, American targets, who do not seek to bring down the nation-state system. I'd call it the reformers, versus the revolutionaries. And when openings have been created in political systems in Arab states, the reformers, mostly the local manifestations of the Muslim Brotherhood, have engaged in elections, have participated, and have used the democratic tools that have been at their disposal. You could call it nationalist versus post-nationalist. It doesn't really matter the heading you give it. But if you see, and unfortunately a popular culture of Islamophobia, which has taken root here and in many other places in the world, and if you see all this in one undifferentiated sea of hostile green, to be honest, then you really are buggered. If you begin to disaggregate, and that means a change in the approach to political Islamists, to Hamas and to many others, then I think that's another way of beginning to deal with the meaning of reframing this question.
Thank you. Chris, and I want to ask Richard to respond, and then I really want to move out, but do you, I know there are some things you want to put on the table, but let me ask you, you're a libertarian.
Yes. I admit it.
Libertarians are opposed to sort of big government, big wars, etc., so that's not a leap. Where are you with Richard's thought that a Marshall-like plan, and let me just tell people what a Marshall-like plan is. Well, let's use Japan, which did come up in the discussion that Richard threw out there about land reform in Japan. When George Bush was talking about the success of democracy in Japan, George Bush never went out there and talked about the fact that we broke up big aristocratic estates and distributed land very broadly in Japan. That was what really was a key stabilizer. And whenever let me just be politically incorrect. There are good occupations and bad occupations. Or let me say, maybe there are no good occupations, but some are more successful than others. And those that are successful typically produce a class of political and economic winners that are winners because of your presence. And the land reform case was a case where there were political and economic winners in that. And John Foster Dulles' concern after World War II was that Japan would slip back into a China-centric, Asia-centric arena, and then embedded Japan deeply in our economy, yes, on terms that were very preferential to Japan rather than us. You Cato types think it was all free trade. That's baloney. But it was a strategic choice to embed Japan's economy in the U.S. government. And to part of a Marshall Plan-like activity, which is a placeholder for looking at economic integration, is what do you think about a Marshall Plan of sorts, or this kind of strategic choice to embed job creation, economic opportunities in there, and do you think it would make a difference?
Well, I think two things. It requires first studying what actually happened with respect to the Marshall Plan. Actually, where did that aid go, and how much?
You guys like the Marshall Plan over at Cato?
Well, I'm just speaking for myself, but I mean, other people who are not libertarians, like Alan Millward, who's a very famous economic historian, have studied the Marshall Plan and concluded that it had only a marginal impact on your economic recovery in Europe. Maybe that marginal portion was the right amount and was appropriate, but I think there is a tendency to believe that were it not for Marshall Plan aid, Europe would have been locked in horrible poverty for decades, and I don't believe that's true. And it really comes down to where do you believe economic opportunity and prosperity comes from, and it's where I would endorse what Hernando de Soto has said about property rights in developing countries are absolutely essential. You cannot have economic development without property rights. It's not just the breaking up of the estates in Japan. It's giving rights to the landholders, to small landholders, which have not been done in places where we've handed out aid without those kind of institutional reforms in place. So I think you have to have institutional reforms beyond just handing out aid. But let me pick up on 2 points. I was going to make 3 points, but I just want to pick up on 2. The first is on occupation. We've all talked about occupation, and I think it's extremely important. It's important to focus on this and to understand the depths of the resentment and hostility that is engendered by it. Now, I could quote, Cato published a paper back in 1998 by one of my predecessors, Ivan Eland, asking the question, does U.S. military intervention abroad breed terrorism, the historical record? And the conclusion was yes. This is December of 1998. Bob Pape, who many of us know, has written on this extensively and wrote a paper for Cato at the University of Chicago, has talked about the role of occupation and terrorism. It's not an Islamist phenomenon because he studies the Tamil Tigers as much as he does anybody else, and shows the importance of occupation. But interestingly, and this is where I think a note of caution is warranted. Even Paul Wolfowitz understood this. Right before the Iraq War, I've cited this quote a number of times. I probably still get it wrong, but right before the Iraq War, he was testifying before Congress, and he said, yes, of course, the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia was a contributing factor to the terrorism against the United States. It was one of Osama bin Laden's principal grievances, and I can't imagine anyone here wanting to be in Iraq creating more terrorists for a decade or more. So even Paul Wolfowitz, at that time, believed that there would not be a long-term occupation of U.S. forces in Iraq. Now we can talk about why that was such a mistaken impression, and there are still many on the right who think that the war in Iraq was a good idea, and the mistake was the occupation. We can talk about that. I think that's a very short-sighted perspective, but it fixes on, oh, well, if only for this one mistake we could have recovered this. But I do want to warn, and I really would like to engage this conversation with Daniel, because you have to be really wary of wishful thinking. I think Fatah made a very grave error in the 1990s by believing that the United States could deliver Israel to them. That was a horrible mistake. And we are now all paying for that. The belief that the United States can deliver Israel, deliver a negotiated settlement. I just don't believe that. And you and I have talked about it in the past, and we can have a whole conversation about that, because now you must deal with Hamas. And nothing I've seen suggests that Hamas is inclined to do what Fatah did 12 or 15 years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong. So beware wishful thinking. We need to we need to kind of be mindful of the realities as they exist today, right now, and who we're dealing with. The second point is, having said that, I still believe that it's an absolutely crucial issue to the war on terrorism. I don't dispute that for a minute. It's just I'm much less optimistic in the short term about resolving it through negotiations. I think there are other ways to do that. We could talk about it. The second thing, though, is a much broader point, and that is we talk about the war on terrorism, and it should be referred to as the so-called war on terrorism, or just not the war on terrorism, because using the military frame, using the war frame, implies two things that are absolutely false. First of all, you do not fight terrorism primarily by military means, and the Bush administration, has not fought terrorism primarily by military means. My favorite example is of the 14 high-value targets that are held in Guantanamo, who were previously held in the secret prisons, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibh. Not a single one of those 14 were captured by the U.S. military. Not one. Every single one was captured by foreign militaries or by our intelligence services acting in cooperation with them. Okay, so that's point number one. The second is that when you talk about a war on terrorism, it leads very quickly to what Daniel said about the danger of this fear of a green peril and talk of World War IV, which, as I understand it, is one of the top-selling books in the country right now. And that is a very, very dangerous frame for us to be waging this conflict. This is a problem, a serious problem, a problem to be managed. It is not World War IV unless we make it World War IV. And I think my favorite work on this is Jim Fallows wrote a terrific article in the Atlantic Monthly last September, which I really like that article. It quotes a number of folks who I've respected, like John Mueller and Ein Lustig and others who've been working on these issues. And I think Richard also touched on this, is the danger of terrorism and the way terrorism works is to prompt you, a democratic society, to overreact, to exaggerate the threat and to take actions against the terrorists that ultimately undermine your own country, your own society, and your standing around the world, and that's exactly what we have done. Their power comes in what they can goad us into doing, and they have been remarkably successful at doing that. And I think that changing that perspective begins by putting this in perspective. We survived the Cold War. It was a horrible period of time. We were existing under the threat of total annihilation. This is not where we are right now unless we make it that way. And I think that has to be our starting point. Thank you.
Richard, I had a conversation with you this morning. Thank you so much, Chris. I had a conversation with you this morning where I mentioned that last night I was commenting on this Benazir Bhutto attack last night, and CNN was showing the spot price of oil had gone above $90 a barrel. And we were talking a little bit about the cost of the war, that before we invaded Iraq, the cost of a barrel of oil was $28. and I am interested in the fact that why do you think the American business community, which is your community, particularly the Republican Party, not to make it partisan, but many of them are associated with the Republican Party, have been so slow to make the fact that war-related increases in the cost of input to this economy are also dramatic costs and take a lot of money out of the pockets of consumers, out of business and others. Do you have any comments on that? Because I thought it was very interesting what you shared this morning.
Well, I was doing business with, up until very recently, doing business with a lot of the airlines in the country. We had business partnerships with a number of them. And that was the group that was hit extremely hard. My answer is that the American economy was in such spectacular shape in 2000 that it takes a lot for it to be felt broadly. And it was felt initially, but as you may recall, oil prices quickly went to 70. I remember finding a magazine, I think it was Business Week, where it says, can the U.S. live with $45 oil? This is a point where oil's at $70. And then it backed off. So, price increases were put through mainly in airline ticket prices, and it backed off, and the airlines actually were making a ton of money there briefly because of that kind of arbitrage. But now that it's up in the 80, 90, I'm not sure we're not going to feel it pretty quickly. And compounded with higher mortgage prices, as we see in this mortgage crisis, I think it just has taken to now for it really to begin to affect everyday life.
Thank you. Well, let me open up a conversation now, which I've been meaning to do, but we'll start here with Bob Dreyfus, and I'm going to encourage everyone to be more brief in their comments at this point, but let's kind of work it around a little bit. Bob?
Start encouraging brief.
Yeah, exactly. Right, because I know you, Bob. No.
Well, I guess I wanted to pick up a little bit.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. And we'll use the mic if it works. If not, just use your lungs.
It works.
All right.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the Democrats and this idea of reframing terror, which I was hoping we'd hear more about today. There was just a study put out by the EU on terrorism in Europe in the year 2006.
Right.
And said they listed 500 acts of terrorism that had struck EU member countries that year. According to this report, only one of those 500 was committed by an Islamist. That's a parallel to the fact that not one American in the last 6 years has been punched in the nose by an angry Muslim since 9/11. And
well, there were efforts by attacks at the LAX.
Well, there were attempts. I'm talking about actual acts of terrorism. Although I've interviewed many former and intelligence officials, all the way up to the former head of the NCTC, John Brennan, and I asked him how many acts of terrorism were actually prevented, serious ones, and he said not one. Now, this was through the time that he left the agency a couple of years ago. All of these were what he refused to say were third trimester acts. In other words, third trimester being something that was sort of viable.
But you would admit there's a dispute about that. I know if Peter Bergen was here, he would...
No, I totally disagree with Peter Bergen's entire thesis. In fact, I think it's wildly exaggerated, and Peter Bergen is one of the people, as Chris Preble just said, who is wildly exaggerating the threat of Islamist terrorism, and he bundles up the fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq to come up with this sevenfold increase in terrorism that he always talks about. My point is, I'm very worried about the fact that the Democrats, in opposing the war in Iraq, which thankfully I do accept, I'm resisting saying anything about the silly idea of soft partition and what a catastrophe it would be for Iraq. Mm-hmm. But okay, if you're going to reframe the war on terrorism to refocus our energy on terrorism, I don't know what that means. I don't know what the Democrats have in mind. If it's somehow to wage the global jihad everywhere against terrorism outside of Iraq, or focus on, I don't know what they mean. And I guess I'm one of the people who thinks that this whole threat is being wildly exaggerated, that 1,000 cops from the FBI and 1,000 smart intelligence people could deal with terrorism. We don't need a Homeland Security Department, a Patriot Act, a military, and all this stuff that we have to deal with what's essentially a modest policing issue.
which is how Gordon Brown is now framing it, interestingly enough, as a police and criminal act. Steve Schleicher? Or didn't you have your hand up?
I actually did.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I won't just call on people I know, by the way. I'm glad Steve's here, because I knew it would. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Steve. Daniel, you talked about disaggregating the threats, and you talked about one group that Peter Bergen also talks about, which is the committed, long-term strategists who wish to bring the system down and who have shown a certain capability to plan and execute acts of terror that really got people's attention, and not just in 9/11, but well before that. The whole Al-Qaeda and the global jihadi threat, essentially. How would you, first of all, I wonder if the panelists can talk about how do you call it? Do you take it seriously? What label do you put on the collective effort to defeat this very dangerous threat that I think is at the heart of the American response, largely because of 9/11?
Interesting. Should it be collective, Daniel? Yeah, I'm going to collect a few, but I mean, we'll come in. Ezra Klein, and then in the very back, Joe Ellen. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, yeah.
Do you mind?
No, not at all.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I certainly would pursue the themes that have been brought up, and one is this notion also of disaggregating, which is in large part why we're being successful to some degree in Iraq. We're combing out, which I mean really is the story in the Middle East, combing out who the interests of various groups, identifying them, from those who are super radical, that small group, and really targeting that. So this branding of everything as Al-Qaeda has had not just the effect of sort of confusing us, but it's also lumped in people who felt they had no other choice but to sort of associate themselves with this. So it's had a very detrimental effect. But I enjoyed what I would say is a very passionate and thoughtful presentation. But I'm left a little bit feeling that it's a sort of assertion over data and argument. And I'm wondering, do the panelists feel that they are confident? The only thing I've heard today is really a sort of Bob Pape representation of this sort of occupation. So he's done a real study on this. Are there enough studies out there that we can confidently say what the terrorist threat is, and we have the data to support who the terrorists are?
Good question. Ezra?
Thanks. I enjoyed everybody's presentations quite a bit, and I thought Chris and particularly made some great points. But I will say that I think the focus on the global war on terror framing is a bit late. I think global war on terror has exhausted itself.
I tried to do it in September '05.
Sure.
I'm irritated we still have to discuss it because they keep using the word.
But right, and Daniel was right to say he's sad we have to have these conversations about language, but to some degree I think we don't. I think Iraq has ended the global war on terror because people cannot, and this country will not, accept that they have lost a war against terrorists, but they can't accept that they cannot continue an occupation. So I think in and of itself that metaphor is falling apart. But nor do I think the global war on terror and the acts that we have committed in the aftermath of 9/11 had that much to do with each other. I don't think that Iraq, I don't think a lot of what we did came from overzealous commitment to a metaphor. When Flint was here, he was making a lot of points about what that let us do. But it wasn't, I think, so much what it let us do as what the people in the executive office chose that America would do. I mean, this was very, very actively done. And I think that to some degree, the global war on terror is just a symbolism. It's standing in when we talk about how to beat that for something Daniel mentioned, which is that you don't have opposition. And it's not that you don't...
Back for 2 seconds.
Sure.
When I watched carefully the C-SPAN vote on the Kyle Lieberman resolution, I didn't feel that the metaphor of global war on terror was anachronistic at that point or was over. I mean, I felt as if this was still a dominant metaphor, as Bob Dreyfus said, that brought many Democrats into... And Republicans in it. So I just want to sort of bring a contemporary moment that's, in my mind, disconcerting, that might be a counterpoint.
But that's exactly right. I mean, I would just question the causality. I think the global war on terror is conveniently invoked. And it is instead a stand-in for the fact that, as you said, there's no opposition party. And more to the point, it's not that there isn't an opposition party, but that in politics there isn't currently an opposition philosophy. There isn't a strong structure in which people feel confident to make the opposite vote. And they speak of the global war on terror, but I think that it's what's underlying it. I mean, they're just shorthanding. Those aren't particularly sophisticated speeches going on over there. And so I think it isn't that I so much question what we're talking about here, because I think why using the term global war on terror, we're actually getting at some good issues, but it's much, much deeper than that. You could kill that metaphor today and nothing would change. Nothing will change until the Democrats, but more to the point, some Republicans as well, feel confident in an alternative vision of foreign policy that they can vote on and they feel comfortable standing atop of.
Interesting. Yes. Susan, could you? There we go.
Thanks.
Get everybody's voice in here.
Since there are some members of the press, I'll try not to be too interesting. Just Jonah Blanket, Senate Foreign Relations. I think that the presenters have been absolutely accurate about a whole lot of what is wrong with the framing of this question, and as an anthropologist, I'm amazed that there isn't more effort in the part of the administration and Congress to see what really is going on in the Muslim world. I think, though, that we've been a little bit too willing to let the American public and the press off too easy. Why is it that we have a vote like the Kyle Lieberman declaration of war on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? Because it's very easy to vote for something like that. It's very difficult to vote against it. I'm proud that my boss voted against it and that all of the other senators that I urged voted the right way on this. But that's a tough vote. Why is it a tough vote? Because the press gives a complete free pass to anyone who buys into this framing of the issue, and because the public is too disengaged and too unwilling to look at what is very clearly the situation on the ground and punish bad behavior and reward good behavior.
Thank you. Yes, sir, right here.
Just very... Oh. Yeah, just very briefly, I appreciated the comments that you made, that there's a whole depth that we still need to pursue on this. And I would recommend, Steve, that you do a second session. Having in the first session concentrated on terrorism from we, they, and projecting into the Middle East and doing Arab-Israeli, that we return to something that's very sensitive, but it's the United States who promotes the war on terrorism by way of framing. Europeans used to do it, have done it for 20 or 25 years as a policing action, in a way. So we're the ones who innovated. So I think in terms of all the analysis of the educated people here, we need to return to what did the United States do? What are the patterns of terrorism and counterterrorism? How did we react? What did we do? How ingrained are those patterns of activity? What do they mean right now? Have we peaked in this kind of, what I think kind of is a dark projection in the world on this? But we wouldn't concentrate so much on the Middle East as we would on the American sources of activity in reaction to 9/11. And then Afghanistan, October 10, and then Iraq. It's kind of, to my mind as a researcher, it's seamless, and we need, even though it's sensitive area, we need to focus on our own activities.
Right. I mean, part of just a quick response for myself. I mean, I'm not letting any of my partners here respond yet because I want to get more voices up, but I do want to tell what my track is. What I wanted to hear today was language. I actually just wanted to hear just a bunch of, where Bob Dreyfus is, Ezra is, just because we're thinking possibly, if we can raise the money, of having a larger foray into this in looking at deliberative polling and actually how you change the way in which people hear and think about these issues. There are different issues. There's one on the substantive issues, which I think Ezra was getting at, that you could change the language and what's beneath might not change. I'm not sure I agree with that. But there is the level of framing and how people conceptualize it, what the shorthand is. And I think Peter Beinart, trying to do good, did a lot of bad by basically writing a piece that said that the organizing force for whether you're for gay rights, you're a feminist, whether you're worried about the environment, that jihadism ought to be at the central core of every NGO movement in America. And it just was outrageous. And it was the single most influential essay in Democratic Party politics and foreign policy. And people just argue with me left and right, as I'm dead set against Peter Beinart's framing. But to deny that became the influential force, that's what drives you into Bob Dreyfus's framing. I think then the other side of it is, on the Republican side, what's been interesting to me is I can find Republican after Republican after Republican after Republican who basically doesn't see it that way. And they naturally walk around with a mental template that almost disaggregates it and resists strongly this. Now, I know that there are other folks here, and there are some here in this room who disagree with that. But what's interesting to me is the dissident Republican camp is much more the home of the creative thinking on reframing. So I just want to I want to get this question here, Mitzi, and then I want to come back to the symposium. And then we'll go to David Nozilia. So you guys sit in the back. You shouldn't. You should be in the front seats. We'll go to you next, okay? But I just want to make a point, because you guys come to New America programs all the time, and I try to get people to sit up in the front. And you're
We're all replaying high school.
Yeah, I know. Mitzi, just briefly, so we can get to everybody. Yeah, it's on.
Okay. I guess there are two things. My own perception was the poison that got put into the water was you're either with us or against us. And that if you're against us,
some of the people you work with did that. I just... Truth in advertising, you know? Okay. I'm sorry.
But what I watched it do is paralyze what I thought was the press. And I thought the press really failed us. I mean, and I had long conversations with Marvin Kalb about this. And many of the thinking press were just heartsick over what happened. The other thing I want, because I do think the question of language is incredibly important. Part of what I found intriguing is apparently the new chairman, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, has said he no longer wants to use the word GWOT. So you have people within the system that want to get around it, but also they get tramped with. If you're not with us, you're against us, you're a traitor. And that's very hard to deal with. So when you talk about how the Democrats didn't have any spine, it was really hard for them.
Then right here, and then we'll, quick reaction and then go back, I promise.
Yes, Miriam
Next,
Gisevich and Stephen, thanks again for a great program. Wanted to go back to your initial statement about performance and the whole question of performance and the terrorists and also the side, in the sense of performance from the American side. And it just strikes me that part of the problem of this whole situation is that everything, when we talk about war, is always cast as an epic, and it's never cast as a tragedy. So we have the consequences.
Kind of like Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations.
Yeah, it's always an epic, you know. It's like,
and then a tragedy.
And that's ultimately the difficulty also for the press, because the moment it starts to be cast, it's like, here we've got attacked in 9/11, and the great epic president has a chance to make history, right? And then the consequences of that, the tragedy, you know, is always something that we are very uncomfortable dealing with.
I want to come up here, but I think that that's really essential. What bothers me in this political town in which we live,
Should I pass
Richard,
this around?
Pass it back to this gentleman and we'll work to everybody. What bothers me about the theatrical dimensions of politics is that when I look at what most worries me, and most of you who read the blog or whatever know I worry not about a classic build-up of a predetermined decision to go to war against Iran. I worry a lot about an orchestrated accidental spark that would lead to a quick escalation war with Iran, and what that means for the theater of politics in an election year. Can any Democrat who's the leading come out and say, oh, by the way, let's really go back to the UN. Oh, by the way, let's really slow down and give Nick Burns more time. And why? Because there's a distance between the substance of what needs to be done that Flint Leverett is talking about, of doing a Nixon goes to China move to change the strategic vectors, or plan a package of things that would both disaggregate, go along the lines that Richard Vague has initiated to talk about what do you do to capture the imagination and interests of publics that are being distracted by that. I think it's very hard because the theatrical dimensions have real substantive consequences, and that's what's interesting. But let me ask for some quick reactions from particularly Richard, and since we've given away all our mic, oh no, you've got right.
So, but can we change the play to make it a tragedy instead of an epic?
If you got out and wrote more, you know. But then we'll have some reactions and then go in the back. No, don't worry, he's next, and I'll get to David too. David's David's also part of the empire, previous part of the empire. Yes, Richard?
Yeah, I think the comment I believe Ezra made that there is no alternative vision is the key issue. I mean, you can't find it anywhere. And you and I were talking about this within the last week. You know, you don't even know who to go to get it.
Right, exactly.
And so so you end up with Hillary Clinton being very hawkish to try to kind of fend it. I think she's very smart. I think perhaps that's what she ought to be doing. But you can't go anywhere and find a vision that enough people will rally around to make an impact in the debate. So I think the comment that there is no other side is the issue. Now, my comments really said, right now, if there's a debate, it's do we stay in Iraq or do we get out of Iraq? Well, my thought is, if you get out of Iraq, you still haven't solved the underlying problem. You still are generating new terrorists around the world because of occupation and oppression. So what I've tried to do is create a little bit of a vision, an alternative vision that is positive. I'd rather instead of having an epic or a tragedy, I would rather have something that's positive to rally around. Let's build rather than tear down. And that's the vision I would like to see happen. I'll say one other thing. We talked about, comment was made about lack of quantitative data. Well, I didn't bring charts and graphs. There's a lot of quantitative data. Perhaps it hadn't been compiled the appropriate way. Whether you go to South America or Africa, the Middle East or Asia, there's a lot of quantitative data. One of the projects we're thinking about doing this upcoming year is creating an anti-terror index by simply going in and measuring two things. One of those is the actual participation in bona fide elections and the actual distribution of income within a given country. And just publish a real simple number that's a function of those. And I think some of the governments that we've supported and touted and been friends with aren't going to look real good when we create that index. And
U.S. and China should be very low in that.
Well, I think the U.S. would rate it. I think the U.S. is a profoundly fabulous place.
Oh, in terms of actual participation and distribution of income, think about those two things in the China and the U.S. context, and it begins to erode this issue of oppression.
What's interesting is we ought to, just to do this, because I know Steve's firm that he works with, but it would be interesting, because that's an interesting point. We should actually get together with your firm, which we'll talk about indexes that would actually be a very interesting
because I don't see Steve with a calculator anytime soon, but I think, Pakistan isn't going to look real hot. Saudi Arabia isn't going to, Egypt's not going to look real hot. So I think I'd love, my whole background's quantitative, and I'd love to see quantitative discipline process.
What's interesting is if Flint was here, he had to run off to have a lunch with a deputy foreign minister of Russia. But if he'd be here, there'd be a cool debate going on here between the two of them, because Flint wants something very different. He wants stability now. He basically says, let's put this democracy stuff aside, wants stability, and then he wants comprehensive deal-making. And then in that environment, then begin moving. So it's an interesting and real debate, but didn't mean to interrupt you. Finish there. Okay. Daniel, quick reactions before we go to the last round of comments? I think it's over.
Well, I think just to comment briefly on this stability, democracy, I do think whoever the genius who came up with the idea of democratization but a total unwillingness to engage with any shade of political Islam was, yes.
Who was that?
No, gives her too much credit, I think. I wouldn't have a problem calling the collective Al-Qaeda and friends. And obviously there are military and intelligence and closing down the financial channels that are part of your effort to counter that. I just think the whole other piece, the whole context in which they operate piece, it's relevant, the context in which they operate. As soon as you frame this as good and evil, as soon as you frame this about that they're just bad folk, rather than the fact that their ability to recruit, their ability to receive cover, their ability to generate popular support in a given political climate is a consequence of policies, including, and I'd say very high up there on the list, American policies. As soon as you exclude that from the debate, I just don't see how you can have it. Look, Israel did a body and prisoner exchange with Hezbollah 3 days ago. Israel is conducting a dialogue with missiles, but also with political implications with Hamas across the border with Gaza right now. I think there's a hell of a lot more mutual respect in the dialogue between Israel and Hamas right now that's being conducted by missiles than in the dialogue of words that's being conducted with Fatah. And I think that could segue in all kinds of interesting directions. Just one other thought. Look, in terms of the presidential debate, the presidential campaign here context, the framing and the debates and the way this plays out in those debates obviously has an educational role and has some kind of a narrowing of options implication. Yeah, I'd say that if I were confident that any of the leading candidates would actually get, when they came in, even if they had to phrase it differently during a campaign, that when they came in they would radically change their approach, I guess most of us could kind of stick our fingers in our ears and grin and bear it. But the real worry is whether there's a capacity to drum up a constituency and a compelling alternative that would cause a likely change in policy. The most compelling alternative I heard was in a 2-minute interlude 2 nights ago in Madison Square Garden in between songs by Bruce Springsteen. But I haven't heard that from any of the presidential candidates. They haven't come. Oh, Springsteen was great, but no, but he gave these are my American. I mean, it's easier when you're doing it in between Born to Run and something else. But he gave these are my American values. And this is my America, and this is a 7-year aberration, and this is why we need to turn the corner, kind of thing. But it's maybe easier when you're doing it.
Thanks, Daniel. I want to pick up on 2 comments. The one about war is not an epic, war is a tragedy, and also the question about why is it that the Europeans dealt with the terrorism problem as a police action, and the United States dealt with it as a military problem. Well, there's your answer. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and we've got a really big hammer. So therefore, the lesson and why I do see a political constituency that is waiting to be mobilized, a political constituency that says preventive war against Iran, for example, just to pick a country out of the hat, would cost roughly 3 times what our war in Iraq has cost and take 3 times as long, and in the end it likely will not deliver decisive security. I'm opposed to that kind of a war. And it puzzles me why a politician couldn't make such a statement and say, and that's why I'm advancing our security, because I don't believe in investing our military resources in that ridiculous way. Now, granted, that's my perspective. No, he didn't. But I do think we have to focus on why. One of the explanations for why we have a tendency to militarize things is because we cast 9/11. We cast 9/11 as Pearl Harbor. And if you cast 9/11 as Pearl Harbor, then there was a decisive victory in World War II, of course, and we all celebrate what happened in Japan, but that was not, obviously, what happened on 9/11, and we are stuck in that frame, and we want to believe that there is a decisive military solution and peace at the end. That's not the way this war is going to be fought.
Okay, I'd like to, thank you, Chris. I'd like to go around to everyone in the back and comments, and I'm going to ask Richard to do it. Yes, sir. You've been very patient. Thank you.
I haven't been, but you've been very kind. Steve Bonblatt from Basic. It was a very rich discussion, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that were said. I think the problem with the way the global war on terrorism is that this administration has used it as a rhetorical device rather than as an operational concept. Right. A real war doesn't get its name at the beginning of it. Most real wars get named sometime later by historians or journalists. And this has kept us from looking at dealing with terrorism in the way real wars are conducted. The first thing you do is you put together a strategy. I've seen nothing coming out of this administration that looks like a true strategy. For example, what's our desired end state? I mean, that's pretty much in the military a fundamental question in a real war. If you can't say what you're trying to achieve in a pretty, as they did in World War II, for example, unconditional surrender, if you can't come up with an actual end state, you're not likely to achieve it. A real strategy would probably employ some of the things that Daniel was talking about, which one way to look at it is divide and conquer. You don't lump your enemies together. You try and deal discreetly with them. A real strategy would employ the range of tools that governments have, and not just one of them. I just want to say one last thing about democracy and stability, and this will be very short. Isn't the real issue rule of law? In countries where oppression is the real issue, it's because the governments are essentially regimes of exception. They do whatever they damn please without any predictable legal system. I think if we, one of the key points I think in Hernando de Soto in his writings is to regularize the urban poor by bringing them under the legal system. I think if we had 46 Singapores in the world, I think we'd be better off, and though no one would confuse Singapore with a democracy.
You know, I have problems of my own with Singapore, but I largely agree. David, and I'll get up to you, don't worry. Brevity will be rewarded by cookies.
Hi, David Nozilia, like Steve, an old USAA hand. Wishing we still had that most effective tool. I just want to deconstruct a lot of what's been said around here is that, you know, by Steve and by Ezra and by a lot of other people, that I don't think that the war on terror is a vision, is a strategy, is a campaign. I think it's an excuse. There was a real vision in the Cold War, but a lot of times in the Cold War, you've got people saying, in the name of anti-communism, we must, whatever. And I think that that is all that is happening now in the war on terror. In the name of the war on terror, whatever I say must take place. And there is no strategy or vision or anything to be an alternative to.
You know, I want to just again, I don't want to over-editorialize, but what David said and I guess Steve said, how many of you watched Richard Lugar's opening statement in the Petraeus hearings? Just a couple of you. Yeah, you look like you were paid doing it. I'm going to say a great thing about Richard Lugar. Go read it. It is the most devastating, I mean, obviously delivered in Lugarian style, but the most devastating critique of the absence of strategy of the administration, and talked about no matter what he heard from Petraeus that day, he felt as if they were still planting a field in a floodplain. And there was no sense of the relevant weight of this bit of data or this bit of data because there was no broader set of benchmarks. I'd say read this Lugar statement because it is golden, I think, in terms of validating some of the comments that are here today. Joanne?
My name is Joe Freeman. I'm a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. My field's American political history, and I want to make two comments from that perspective. I know we've been talking foreign policy, but foreign policy is always grounded in domestic politics. Comment number one, there is a long tradition in this country of needing an enemy. An enemy is a way of focusing domestic politics. It's an excuse for doing things that otherwise you would not be allowed to do. During most of the 20th century, that enemy was communism. Now it's the war on terror. When I watched us finally get rid of many of the restrictions on civil liberty and on free speech and on other things at the end of the communist era, I sort of held my breath. I'm wondering how long it would last. It didn't last long. So just keep that in mind. We have an underlying problem, which the war on terror is just a manifestation, and we need at some point to deal with this need for an enemy. Comment number two. I do agree that our problems with the Muslim world are rooted in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and until that is resolved, we're going to continue to have problems with the Muslim world, however they manifest themselves. The reason Fatah was mistaken in believing that the U.S. could deliver Israel in the 1990s is because it failed to realize that Israel has major supporters in this country who are big players in U.S. domestic politics, and these Palestinians do not. Many of us know who some of those supporters are. AIPAC has come up on occasion. I wouldn't underestimate the role of the Christian Zionists, who are a little bit under the radar, but not completely, and there are others. But as long as Israel has allies who are major players in U.S. domestic politics, and the Palestinians do not, we're never going to be able to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And at some point, those of us who think about these issues need to think about that very practical consideration.
Thank you. Briefly here.
Yes, Al Richmond. I used to work on survey analysis at the State Department. One of my points, two brief points, will relate to what the gentleman just said. The global war on terrorism, looking at post-04 data, you could well contend that it was critical in Bush's election. Second, more recent survey data from Pew suggests that the U.S.-led war on terrorism has steadily lost support around the world. These are two things which sort of affect the environment in which we're talking.
And you're looking at survey data now?
Pew data, yes. Pew data came out in the spring. And one of the questions asking about over 40 countries was favor or oppose the U.S.-led war on terrorism. In 02,
have people said, I just want to quick, because I am interested in this framing issue and this possibility we might do this deliberative polling exercise. Have people substitute alternative framing in that?
Not in that particular question by that organization.
So they're just testing that one frame and not suggesting.
But that's been asked repeatedly since 02.
I see.
And it's steadily lost ground.
I see.
In most countries where we have a good trend.
Interesting. 30 seconds, Gary. Yep.
I want to introduce an entirely different
not
thought here.
Though, but 30, yeah, just briefly because we're.
Hold on, Steve. I'll get there. There's a parallel here as it relates to the question of language. I'm not going to have anything to do with policy right now. And the parallel is to take a hard look at what happens in the consumer product world when they are faced with situations like this. And in simple terms, you have two choices. You introduce a new product or you restage an old brand. And what's critical, the beginning point in all of this, and I just want to be sure that we think about it here, is before anything happens on the product side, you have to make a decision about what target audience you're talking about. There is no such thing as how to position a product, whether it's a new one or a restaged one, for the universe of 300 million people. You've got to know who your prime prospects are, where that target audience is, and what issues and what product features and language are important to them. So I'm only trying to suggest that two things. One, that it all begins with a clarity about who you think your target audience is, and understanding what's important to them about, or what resonates with them. And then you have to be sure that your product, in this case a policy, speaks substantively to what you've learned in the research side of the equation.
Thank you, Gary. And then I want to finish with Richard. Richard. Oh, I'm sorry. I gave them all away.
I just want to make three comments, and thank you, Steve. The first is, on the issue of democracy, a comment was made about Singapore. I was just in Singapore. I'm affiliated with the Tisch School of the Arts in New York, and Tisch opened a university, a graduate art school in Singapore just this past week. I believe you got to get to a democracy. Singapore is only about 3 million people. Lee's type of government doesn't work, I don't think, if there's 20 million people or 200 million people or 1 billion people. You got to get there. I don't think, frankly, that style of government outlives Lee himself. I mean, when he dies, there's a quandary. So I'm not sure that's an example of how things can sustainably be handled.
You can finally drop the medical subscriptions for gum.
There you go. Yeah, you
can get gum if you get a medical prescription.
I love the country where gum is illegal but prostitution isn't. The second thing.
Okay, we got to go ahead.
I want to take up something Daniel said a minute ago when he was talking about Fatah and Hamas, and I want to just restate it perhaps with different language. I think as I've studied this, one of the phenomenon that seems to always recur is the idea of splinter groups. When the original oppression or occupation occurs, you get an opposition group, such as IRA. But inevitably, if that persists, what happens is the original group, the IRA, at some point in time breaks down and tries to negotiate with their oppressor. And at that point in time, some subgroup says, well, screw that. No way are we going to talk to these guys. And a splinter group is formed. The first one formed in that case was the real IRA. But look there, and there was the INLA. There was 5 or 6 that we could all name off the top of our heads. This again happens again and again and again in the Middle East. I think the number of splinter groups that you have in a given conflict and the virulence of their vision is simply evidence of how long that conflict has persisted. Because the original group really had its complaint grounded in everyday oppression or occupation. But the group that splinters off from there has a little bit more virulent vision. And then 2 or 3 splinters later, you've got this, we've got to reestablish the caliphate in Spain. Now, there's only 20 guys in that group, but it is the most violent or virulent expression of that. So I think the concept of splinter groups is an important one for analysis of any of these situations. The last comment I'll make, really, Chris, to take up on what you said, I don't disagree at all that the Marshall Plan financially didn't do much. I mean, if you look at it stated in today's terms, it's probably only $100 to $200 billion was all the money we gave out in today's dollars. You look at our economy, we're what, $11, $12 trillion economy? It's a tiny amount of money. Look at the wars of trade. It's a tiny amount of money. I think what was important about the Marshall Plan was its symbolism. And in my view, symbolism, the provision of a vision, may be the very most important thing.
Thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate all of your indulgence. I know there are more questions, but we've already run over. But I'm conflicted about today, and I want to put this on the table because I was with a guy who was a Chinese foreign ministry recently, and I've used this a number of times, but it was serious. His response was kind of a joke, but I asked him, what are you working on? He says, well, we're trying to figure out ways to keep you involved with small little Middle Eastern countries because the benefits to China in this environment have been dramatic. That as the politics of distraction, the realities of distraction have created opportunities for China. So the reason is, and the reason I'm raising this is to raise an interesting point of tension. Of are we really focusing on what really matters? On another side of this, Big Brzezinski quite powerfully says frequently that the challenges in the Middle East today are the defining challenges for America in this era. In other words, if we get it wrong, we get a lot more wrong. That the repercussions and ongoing waves of impact by getting it wrong are there. And so it does drive you into this question of terrorism. So much has ridden along that's been bad in this, that one of the things that I'll just put on the table I'm thinking about is this metaphor that is enduring no matter our best efforts to undo it, and Mike Mullen's efforts to undo it, and I'd like to wish it away. Nonetheless, if it can help you at some point think about how do you reach an audience, how do you look at the economic dimensions of this, how do you deal with bridge building in the Middle East and Israel-Palestine, how do you deal with some stuff that maybe that's a groove we need to think about developing rather than just rejecting it wholesale. Maybe there perhaps a different set of packages that can work along those vehicles. So I'm conflicted, and I just wanted to put that on the table because I look forward to many of you being partners in this discussion as I continue to think about it, as I continue to be a sort of geostrategist worrying a little bit about leaving the world open to China. Not that China's all that nefarious, but the fact is it matters, and it matters in big systemic ways. That's where I'm at. But I want to thank all of you for engaging in a conversation which we're going to draw from as we think through our next steps. And it was great of you to respond so quickly. We had an overwhelming response of interest, and we'll keep at it. So thank you all.